under some conditions, if there was some another defect, an instability can conceivably lead to such an explosion.
What had you learned? What sort of problems was NASA encountering? That oscillation problem you mentioned on the
I'm not sure. I know that at least I've heard that at least in the development stages of those boosters, they have experienced some instabilities.
So there have been problems which we had not necessarily heard about, and you also go ahead.
We have not heard about them, but NASA knows about them, and the other people know about them, and they've been working on them. It's not that we have had a problem and it was left unattended to. This problem has been worked on, and I'm sure that if they decided to attach this booster to the shuttle, then they felt that the problem has been taken care of.
One more question. Is a solid fuel or the hypergolic fuels, is one more safe than the other?
You cannot say. It depends on the circumstances, depends on the design of the rocket motor. You really cannot make a general
One scenario is possible. They could have encountered a problem aboard one of or both of the solid booster rockets, which could have ignited in some way the liquid booster container.
Only after the explosion. You know what? As long as the combustion is contained within the casing of the solid booster.
But we saw some tape right after the initial explosion there of at least one of the boosters still, or possibly two, still going on their course. What would that indicate to you?
I suspect that instability occurred in one of the boosters, not in both of them. And once it's exploded, then there was so much fuel on board in the liquid rocket and in the other solid booster that they just joined. Maybe the first explosion could have triggered the others to explode. But I suspect that one of them had some defect in it, something happened, it may have gone unstable, exploded, and then the rest of the Challenger, just exploded also.
Professor Zinn, thank you for joining us today from Georgia Tech University.
Thank you.
And we continue our live coverage. Marianne?
Thank you, Dave. As you know, at this point in time, the first participant in the Teacher in Space program, Sharon Krista McAuliffe, a 27-year-old social studies teacher from Concord High School in New Hampshire, was one of the crew members aboard this flight. And joining us now from Concord, New Hampshire, is one of her students, Mark Wittalian. Thank you for being with us this afternoon on what must be a very, very difficult day for you. Mark, can you explain to us exactly what it was like when you and the other students were watching what happened on television?
Well, we were just shocked that it had happened. Nobody even knew what was going on. I mean, we were just so surprised. I don't even think it's hit everybody yet.
What was the first reaction from you and your fellow students when you realized that indeed there was a disaster taking place and not an exciting, perfect mission and liftoff as we had first thought?
Well, we were really quiet. We didn't say anything, We sat around for a couple of minutes and they told us to go back to our classrooms. But we were just stunned.
Are you at home now, Mark? We understand that the students were sent home from school. Can you tell us something about your teacher, Krista McAuliffe?
Well, she wasn't my teacher, but I knew her, and she seemed pretty nice, and I feel, bad about that happened.
I'm sorry, Mark, can you speak up?
Well, she wasn't I didn't have her in any classes, but I knew she was. She was, a nice person. I think that it was good that she won the candidacy, but I can just say, now that I feel bad for her husband and her kid.
All right, thank you. Mark Wittalian of Concord High School, one of the students who knew one of the astronauts aboard the Challenger today, Krista McAuliffe of Concord High School in New Hampshire. Tom?
For those of you who may be just joining us, tragedy strikes NASA. 7 astronauts, including the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, were apparently killed 1 minute after liftoff this morning from the Kennedy Space Center. Let's go back now to the Shuttle Challenger on the launch pad. Launch pad 39B, the first time this had been used for 10 years. It was last used in the Apollo program, but NASA redesigned and refitted this launch pad to allow the shuttle to launch from here, to give them 2 launch pads at the Kennedy Space Center.
9, 8.
Just a few seconds, you'll see the shuttle's 3 main engines fire up and start. Everything appeared to look normal.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good, roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range.
The shuttle has completed its roll procedure here.
Engines beginning throttling down now.
The brown
94%.
object you see in the center is the external tank that contains the highly volatile fuel, 2 solid rockets which propel the shuttle to its orbit on both sides of that tank.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
Because the shuttle goes through its most stress, they keep the engines down to 65%.
Downrange distance, 3 nautical miles.
The 2 solid rockets were not supposed to leave the side of the external tank and the external tank separation for another 7 minutes after the disaster occurred. This is where they throttle up, and the last words from the shuttle. It explodes in a huge fireball, one of the solid rockets veering to the right, another going to the left. Through the flame that's still burning there and the cloud, you could not see anything left of the shuttle. Let's go. We have a cutaway drawing here that I'd like to show you. There are contingencies just in case the shuttle careens out of control. NASA has 2 areas on the external tank that contain explosive charges. This is an option on every launch that they have. Not saying that it was used this time, but it exists, that if the shuttle would careen over a populated area, the range officer at Cape Canaveral Air Force Base, just down the coast, carefully monitors the shuttle's ascent, and should a point of impact where the spacecraft should suddenly fall, at the fingertips is a switch that would send an encrypted signal to start the detonation. We're not saying that this did occur, but it is one of the contingencies that will be investigated, I'm sure, as they look into this tragedy that struck the NASA shuttle program, and we've lost 7 of America's astronauts. Reed?
Tom, Senator John Glenn, the first American in orbit, now a senator from the state of Ohio, is about to tell us his feelings from the Senate gallery.
And it finally has arrived. We hope we could push this day back forever. But the people that were on the flight today carried our hopes and dreams along with them, and they'll live forever in our memories. And I guess that's the best tribute we can give to them. Our prayers, our sympathy, our condolences go out to their families and friends, and I guess that's about all we can say about them right at this time. It's been an amazing success story up to this very tragic accident today. I think this was, what, the 56th or 57th manned mission, where we're dealing with new complexities and speeds and powers that man has never used before. And we had hoped to push this day back forever, but that was not to be, and we all, I guess, intuitively knew that. So today we don't want to repeat, that's for sure.
Senator, what effect does this have on a space program or any sort of flight test program when something like this happens?
Oh, it delays things, of course, because there will be a very complete investigation. Our view of what happened this morning would be only speculation at this point, although the very slow-motion pictures I saw on one of the channels a little while ago seemed to show the first light coming out of one of the solid rocket cases. Whether that'll turn out to be the cause of the difficulty or not, I don't know. But I wouldn't think that this was, you know, what it'll do to the program or how much it'll be set back will be dependent on the investigation.
NASA trying to push too hard on this, Senator?
No, I don't think so. If there's one thing NASA has not done all the way through, it is take a chance on cutting corners. And we've grown accustomed to success. And it's been an amazingly successful program so far. You know, I remember one of the TV commentators, I won't say which network, but one morning talking about when there was a delay, commenting, when are we going to get turn this turkey into an eagle? We'd become so accustomed to getting these things off on time that safety was obviously being, at least in that commentator's mind, was being given short shrift. Why aren't we running these things like a regular airline schedule? Well, the fact that NASA has not done that. They've run it with the idea of safety first and foremost, and that's been the way it's been operated ever since the days when I was in that program many years ago. It's a tribute to them that they have not been goaded under pressure to taking any chances. And we'll just have to wait the accident analysis to see what happened in this case.
Senator, were you watching the blast off this morning?
I was not. I was in a classified briefing at the time, and one of my staff people brought a note in to me about this, and then I left immediately and went up to my office.
What was your reaction, particularly to the replays you've probably seen?
Oh, my reaction was a profound sense of loss, I guess, that this day had finally come that we'd hoped would never arrive. In some ways, I guess it's, you know, in our human existence, let me be philosophical for a moment. I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. And we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
When you say that this was a day that was pushed back for a quarter of a century, was it inevitable that it would finally come?
Well, I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning, that the answer to that is no. But that doesn't mean that man doesn't keep trying in these areas and that we're not just as dedicated to seeing that this kind of research goes on.
Senator, you've been part of a small and very select community of people, the community of astronauts. What does this do to that community when something like this happens?
Well, we've never had something like this happen before, except for the pad fire, the fire on the pad that claimed 3 lives. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chafee back in '67, I believe it was. So we went through that tragedy then, but that was not an in-flight accident. Obviously, there will be a shared sense of loss in the whole astronaut group and community, everybody associated with the whole program, whether astronauts or all those in the supporting functions. But I'm sure their dedication is going to be to find out what caused this and correct it and get on with the next flight.
Do astronauts just simply accept this as part of the job?
I think any time you go into flying or test flying, or which all of us were in prior to being in the astronaut program early on, you accept risks, but you feel that the risks are worth it for the country and the importance of what you're doing. And you're willing to take those risks. And that's the way we looked at it back then. That's the way I'm sure all of the current group of astronauts looks at it.
How much more of a tragedy is this, since it was the first launch of a citizen in space?
The loss of human life doesn't have much to do with who's military and who's civilian. It's a tragedy for their friends and families, and I don't differentiate between the loss of life, whether it was the regular flight crew or whether it was a civilian on board with them.
How much does it set back the Citizen in Space program, do you think?
I don't know. I have no way of knowing at this point. They had lined up some other people to go, of course. Whether this will affect that or not, I don't know.
Do you think it should?
Does this raise questions for the SDI program?
No, I don't think so, because the technologies that were being used here as far as thrust and the engines and whatever happened here, I think probably are not likely to affect the research going on for lasers and laser projection and formable mirrors and particle beam projection and things like that. I would not think it likely that there was a connection there.
Senator, are you
concerned now, or have you ever been concerned about the way NASA procures parts?
No, I never have. NASA has bent over backwards to be as safe as they possibly can be. And whether this will prove to be a one-time difficulty from whatever cause, or whether it will be a design defect that is uncovered now that we can correct, or whatever, we'll have to await analysis. But there's no way of knowing right now, just now, a couple of hours after the accident, to know what happened.
Senator, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
That is Senator John Glenn, the Democrat of Ohio, America's first man in orbit, expressing his sentiments on this morning's tragedy with the 7 aboard Challenger that exploded soon after takeoff. Bob?
Thank you, Reed. If, as is feared, none aboard the Shuttle Challenger survived today's disaster, 7 American space pioneers lost their lives. The commander of this mission was Francis R. Scobee. Known as Dick Scobee, he was 47 years old, born in Cle Elum, Washington. He became a NASA astronaut in 1978. Scobee was pilot of the Challenger mission in 1984, during which the crew retrieved, repaired aboard the Challenger, and returned to orbit the ailing Solar Maximum mission satellite. He was the commander of this mission.
36-year-old Judith Resnick was one of 3 mission specialists aboard this flight. From Akron, Ohio, a degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD from the University of Maryland. During her mission on an earlier shuttle flight on her first trip, the crew successfully deployed 3 satellites. She had logged 144 hours, nearly 145 hours of space flight.
Krista McAuliffe was 37 years old. She was born in Boston, got her BA degree from Framingham State College in Massachusetts, later a master's degree in education. She had taught English and American history since 1970, selected as the first teacher in space in July of last year.
Ellison S. Hanazuka was also aboard the Challenger today, an aerospace flight test engineer with the McClellan Air Force Base, a mission specialist with the, also participated in the first Department of Defense secret shuttle mission.
Gregory Jarvis was 42 years old. He was one of the other payload specialists aboard this Challenger mission. He had worked at Raytheon in Bedford, Massachusetts, and had been an integration manager for other spacecraft programs since 1983.
36-year-old Ronald E. McNair is a PhD. He was also a mission specialist. He was an astronaut since 1978 from Lake City, South Carolina, and graduated from North Carolina A&T State University and had a PhD in physics.
And finally, Michael Smith. He was 41. He was a very highly decorated U.S. Navy pilot, a veteran of Vietnam combat, had flown over 4,300 hours, including 4,000 of them in jet aircraft. He was pilot of this Challenger mission.
CNN has been informed that Donald Regan has asked the Speaker of the House to postpone tonight's scheduled State of the Union address. Let's go to Mr. Speaks in the briefing room.
Scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday. The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the space shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. They concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then, the President said, to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until, and let him address the American people on what's happening here tonight.
Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation?
No, the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the space shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the President believe...
Right. Great.
Larry, is the President also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the weekend? What time is the other remarks tonight?
The President will, will for the balance of the week continue on his previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. The time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry,
Larry,
can you
let's
tell
go one at a time.
the President have any plans to travel or attend any memorial service for the...
Well, at the moment, the NASA is still conducting its search mission there, and of course there's been no memorial service set. The Vice President does go with the personal expression on the part of the President of his concern to those families there, and no travel plans are set as yet.
Larry, two questions. First of all, I know you haven't had any official word, but is the White House operating on the basis that all of the people on the shuttle are dead?
Well, Chris, like every American, we hope, and until we find out otherwise, that hope will continue.
And secondly, to follow up on an earlier question, we were told by the President a few moments ago that he intended to go ahead with the State of the Union. In fact, said while it would cast a pall, the business of governing the nation must go on. What changed his mind in really a very short period of time?
Well, as I indicated to your colleague over here just a moment ago, is that the President, like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Larry,
So,
can you tell us what information the President is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the President has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There is not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.
Is there a special task force either at the White House or somewhere that's keeping him informed, or are there special communications channels set up?
As is always, when there is an event of this nature that occurs anywhere around the world, the White House Situation Room keeps on top of the events. What happened was, as soon as this event occurred almost simultaneously with the television coverage of it, the Situation Room was informed by NASA and has kept abreast of it with an open line to NASA at the Cape since that time.
Well, I was going to go back again on where the idea of postponing the speech
first initiated? Did the
idea,
president initiate
yes, the president initiated the idea of postponing the speech.
Sorry, will the shuttle program be suspended at least until the investigation is through?
Those determinations have not been made. The president indicated to Bill Graham that he should find out the cause of it and then proceed. Now, exactly how that dovetails with future flights will just have to be determined as a result of what NASA determines in their investigation.
On the consideration of whether any civilians will be permitted to continue on shuttle flights, is that also part of the investigation?
Well, to echo the president's words that all of these people were Americans. They were all interested in space. They all came first with courage and second in a spirit of volunteering for this mission. And whether there'll be any change in that, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't think there's any inclination. Joe?
Has the president attempted to contact the family members of anyone who was on the
The president has not yet done that, no, except to send the vice president in expression of his concern.
Is there any feeling here that NASA was pushing too hard? There was a very ambitious program. Was it 15 launches for this year?
I think NASA has a very good record of safety and a very cautious human approach to space exploration, and they have taken those precautions. This is a tragedy of major proportions and one that concerns us all. But for the moment, there is no finger pointing at NASA as far as their safety record.
The question arises particularly because in recent launches there have been some glitches that have come up. As you know, they had a problem with the door, the hatch on this, and their drill wouldn't work and all of that. Does that not give the impression that they may be pushing too fast?
I can't make that judgment from here, but I think if you would look back at other space launches in the Mercury and Apollo program, you would find that there have been postponements. These not because of glitches, but because of an extensive safety program that finds these glitches before launch.
Can you be more specific about what the Vice President will be doing later today specifically, and also the postponement on the State of the Union pushed back the schedule for the budget and other things that were scheduled for next week?
The Vice President's schedule, once he arrives at the Cape, has not been determined, since it's just within the last few moments that the President has asked him to go down.
Well, what's his specific charge? I mean, when
his
you say
specific charge, once again, is to express the President's concern to the families and to accompany the Director of NASA down to the Cape in order to see that the President's directions for an immediate look into the tragedy, into the explosion, is accomplished.
Is he viewed as he overseeing an investigation into this?
I don't think that you can say that yet, Norm. I think this matter is entirely in the hands of the NASA people at the present time, and I don't know of any. There's no further planning beyond that. Question on the budget, that has not been determined. It would be my inclination to say that the budget will probably go up on Wednesday, with the State of the Union on Tuesday. I think the Graham-Rudman law requires that it go up by February 5th, and that they will do. Andrea, then we'll go all the way to the back and work forward.
I just want to follow on Norm. Is it the President's view that perhaps an independent investigation outside of NASA is what is required on the pacing of the program? And
I think everyone is leapfrogging well ahead of events at present. This tragedy is now only hours old. You have a series of actions taken by the President, including a charge to the Director of NASA to find out what happened. And until we do some preliminary studies, none of these questions have answers. So, Pat?
Has the decision been made to have the President officially disclose tonight in his speech what happened, or will we continue to get details from NASA throughout the day, or are they going to hold the President's speech?
NASA will continue to keep you abreast of everything as they know it, as they always have for the entire history of the American space program. So, John?
Larry, you made a point of saying early on that there would be no greater way to honor those who apparently have died in this mission than to continue on with the space program. Is this a deliberate effort to try to counteract any feelings against the program because of the tragedy?
John, the only deliberate effort we're making at the moment is to show our deep concern, our deep emotion, and our desire that America continue in the space program. That's our entire motive, lock, stock, and barrel. Joanna?
Larry, has the President expressed any rue or regret about his proposal to send civilians in space?
The President is obviously concerned about every person that he, as the chief executive officer of the government, he as the President directs. He directs people every day, either directly or indirectly, to conduct missions on the part of the government, the military, NASA, and those. It's a fact of life when the man sits in the Oval Office. He has to make these decisions. And I have not heard him express any regret. Concern, yes. Deep emotion, yes. Sorrow, yes. But regret is not that. It was a decision made, as he said, these individuals are all Americans, and they're all believers in the space program, and that's what's in his mind. So, Walter?
Larry, does the President plan today to speak with any of the relatives, family of any of the...
That hasn't been determined yet, no. Frank?
Can you give us any indication as to what the First Lady was doing at the time that this information became available and what her reaction was?
I don't. We can check with her office, if you will, and see what we can get.
Because the Europeans are able to put up satellites in with unmanned vehicles, doesn't this accident argue per se that unmanned vehicles are a preferable way to put up satellites in orbit?
Once again, you know, I have been a silent observer of the space program and not one that's actively involved, and I'm not competent to answer that.
All right. As you recall, the President made the decision to send a teacher into space. Can you tell us on what he based that decision and who suggested the timing and when the time was right for that mission?
Well, Mike, I don't want to come down hard on you, but what's in the President's mind right now is to find out what happened and to show those families of those people that he's concerned. And that's all that's on his mind at the moment.
Are you operating on the assumption that this is the result of some technological problem, or has anyone suggested the possibility it might be an act of terrorism?
There have been no suggestions either way.
Thank you.
This was, of course, this disastrous accident this morning, the first in-air disaster or fatal accident that NASA has experienced. It's the only other time when astronauts have been killed as part of a space program was actually on the ground back in 1967 on a launch pad explosion as part of the Apollo program. 3 astronauts died in that accident after 16 previous successful missions. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Grissom, Lieutenant Colonel Edward White, and Lieutenant Commander Roger Chaffee were all killed on Apollo flight. It was flight 204. One of the people who witnessed that and was taking careful notice of same is Robert Wussler, who was an executive here with Turner Broadcasting and working for a former network, another network formerly. In January of 1967 was the executive producer of special events and was covering this as it happened. Can you tell us the reaction at the time back in 1967 to the tragedy?
Well, Marianne, it was a different time, it was a different age. The individual astronauts, there were only 15 or 18 at the time, active astronauts, the original 7 of whom 2 were not flying at the time, and a second class of, I believe, about 12, from which Roger Chaffee and Ed White had come from. The public was much more familiar with them. It was truly, there's a good picture of Gus Grissom right now. Ed White, the first man to walk in space for this country. Roger Chaffee right there, the rookie on the flight. Scenes of their memorable funeral procession in Washington and at Arlington National Cemetery. Scenes that I remember quite well. A different time because the individual astronauts were known so much better than, of course, the astronauts of today. There were fewer of them, there were fewer flights. Each one was a major newsworthy event of its time. The news of the accident on the pad at Cape Canaveral on that historic Friday last week in January, almost the same date of today, 19 years ago, spread like wildfire among the news media throughout Cocoa Beach, Florida, Cape Canaveral, and the New York network news centers. At that time, in the NASA space program, there was very heavy security throughout the Cape Canaveral Center, Cape Kennedy, and there were no newsmen on the Cape at the time of the accident. The accident took place about 6:30 at night. We began to hear that there were problems sometime around 7 o'clock or 7:30, and it was not until about 8 p.m. at night that NASA finally made an announcement that there had been an accident. To the best of our knowledge, the 3 astronauts at the time were killed instantly. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was taken to the pad area about 7 days after the accident, and it is still one of the more horrific memories of my days as a newsman.
We have been getting to know all through this morning and early this afternoon the 7 crew members aboard the Challenger who are believed to have been killed in this terrible accident. Can you tell us something about these 3 astronauts
well, of course,
who were the first to be killed in it?
Certainly. I think Gus Grissom was well portrayed in the motion picture The Right Stuff, which was, of course, about the lives of the 7 original astronauts, the Mercury astronauts, as they were referred to, the famous Life magazine photograph when they were announced back in the late 50s, and their progress towards a manned launching in 1961. Alan Shepard was our first astronaut in space for the United States, that having come on May the 3rd, 1951. Gus Grissom was our second astronaut. He went into space, I believe the date was a mid-July date in 1961. He had some problems on that flight. A spacecraft problem happened after his suborbital flight, and a helicopter came along to pick he and his capsule up. It flooded with water, the capsule was lost, Grissom was saved, and there were investigations after the fact as to exactly what happened. Nothing was ever proven or disproven with regard to why that capsule was lost. Ed White, a very popular astronaut, our first walker in space on a Gemini flight in June of 1965. And Roger Chaffee, regarded to be one of the brightest of the young astronauts. There was probably a very good chance that those 2 astronauts would have gone to the moon, certainly on Apollo 11, our first flight, or shortly thereafter. 3 very popular astronauts. It delayed the space program at the time for some 12 or 18 months until we finally got back on the road in 1968, and culminating with a successful lunar landing in July of 1969.
And again, NASA's saying today that it could be months before another space shuttle will be able to be launched because of, until they figure out exactly what happened.
Well, certainly it's going to take a long time to investigate the difficulties of today.
Thank you very much, Robert Wessler, who is the executive producer of special events for CBS when the accident occurred, killing our astronauts in 1967. Bob?
Marianne, among the people watching the launch, preparations for it, and then the launch itself at Kennedy Space Center this morning, first with tremendous pride and excitement, and then in absolute disbelieving horror, were Mr. and Mrs. Edward Corrigan, Edward and Grace Corrigan, the parents of Krista Corrigan McAuliffe, who was just about to become this country's and the world's first teacher in space. It was just last month that Mr. and Mrs. Corrigan spoke with our correspondent, Tony Clark.
What was it like when Krista was selected? How'd you all feel?
Great.
Excited. Very excited.
You all going to be at the Cape? When
Naturally, wouldn't miss it.
Yes, the whole family will be there. We have 4 other children besides Krista, so everybody will be there.
Is this really like her? I mean,
Absolutely.
Let's do this one at a time. Ms. Corrigan, did it surprise you first that she would try to be an astronaut and then be selected?
No on both. I know an awful lot of luck was involved in it, but I'm not surprised because I knew she'd do a good job if she were chosen, and I'm just so pleased that she was chosen.
What's she like growing up?
The same as she is as she comes over now. Exactly the same. She hasn't really changed.
But to people that don't know her and all they know is just what they've seen on TV, how would you describe your daughter, the teacher astronaut?
Oh, very caring, outgoing, excited, interested.
I would think, as father, this is just, I mean, you just got to be really proud.
Yes.
That's...
Absolutely proud.
What do you hope that she gets out of this, or is able to give others out of this?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something that she can pass on to others? Or?
Well, I think that we hope the same as what she's hoping to bring back when she talks about demystifying space, and to come back and let all the other people know that it's not just scientists up there, that for the future everybody will be into space. And I think that's what she hopes to bring back to her children and to the teachers and to everybody in general.
How has she been, just in talking to you all about the training and everything?
Totally excited. I mean, she never goes down low about anything. She's truly right with it all the time. She loves what she's doing. No complaints. But she's got that kind of a disposition anyway. She doesn't complain.
I imagine you all are looking forward to that point where she comes back and just tells you everything.
Yes, and to have her back, too.
Edward Corrigan, the Commander-in-Chief, President Reagan at the White House, learned about this tragedy. He was in his office, in the Oval Office, and he was preparing to meet with a group of reporters and network anchormen, myself included. We were waiting in the Roosevelt room, and we didn't notice when Donald Reagan, the Chief of Staff, got up and left the room, and we didn't notice a few other things, but we learned later that Vice President George Bush and the National Security Advisor, Admiral John Poindexter, who was sitting 2 seats to my right at the table in the Roosevelt room, he slipped out. Charles BIERBAUER, you're there at the northwest lawn of the White House. You were in the room, and you can tell us more.
Well, Bernie, at that point, we heard the president, of course, expressed his horror, his concern at the tragedy that he had, in fact, himself seen unfold watching a replay on the television. It was just at that point that we found out that what had happened, and the president found out about it at the same time. When the president did come in and talk with us, you recall, he said that he thought he would go ahead with the State of the Union address as scheduled this evening. In fact, in the draft, there had been a reference to the space program and the fact that the shuttle was up in space, sort of part of the president's look forward to the 21st century. He indicated, as he spoke with us, that he would certainly make reference to this tragedy into the State of the Union address tonight, and he felt that it was important to let people know that life goes on. However, in the span of the next hour, the president had some second thoughts, obviously, about that. He's canceled the State of the Union address after consultation with leaders on Capitol Hill, the feeling it was better to put it off for a week. He'll make the State of the Union address next Tuesday night rather than tonight. And White House spokesman Larry Speakes explained what went through the president's mind, why in that span of an hour he changed his mind.
Like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Larry, can you tell us what information the president is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the president has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There is not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.
Is there a special task force either at the White House or somewhere that's keeping him informed, or are there special communications channels set up?
As is always, when there is an event of this nature that occurs anywhere around the world, the White House Situation Room keeps on top of the events. What happened was, as soon as this event occurred almost simultaneously with the television coverage of it, the Situation Room was informed by NASA and has kept abreast of it with an open line to NASA at the Cape since that time.
The president will speak to the nation tonight on television about the shuttle tragedy. He has sent Vice President Bush and the director of NASA down to Florida to get together with people down there to find out just what has happened, to convey the president's sincere sympathies to the families of the astronauts who were involved. White House spokesman Larry Speakes called this a tragedy of major proportion, but said that there is no finger pointing at NASA in any sense, that the safety record of NASA has been remarkable up to this point. He said indeed that the president's only concern right now is to find out what has happened, to express his concern, and that's the primary thought on the president's mind at this point. One other note, First Lady Nancy Reagan was also watching television this morning when the tragedy occurred. Her remarks, as conveyed by her, the First Lady's press office, were that it's time we should start praying that there is some thread of hope. And while the White House will not say and is not in a position to describe the fate of the 7 astronauts, there is really very little hope here. Bernie?
Thank you, Charles. Charles BIERBAUER reporting live from the White House. Joining us now on Newsday, John Longston with the Science Policy Program at George Washington University here in the nation's capital. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, we've been taking risks in front of the world really since Alan Shepard's flight in May of 1961. Even at that point, when the first American was going to go into space, there was a major debate of whether to do it live in front of a camera. And the decision then was, yes, that was the kind of program we were going to have, recognizing the risks. The risks now have arrived. Unlike the Soviets, who only announced their manned flights after they're successful, we do this as a sense of common accomplishment, recognizing the risks. Unfortunately, the risks occurred.
That's an interesting point. At that briefing in the Roosevelt Room, President Reagan, he came in and he talked to us for about 12 minutes, a little over, about 75 minutes ago. And I asked the president, I said, philosophically, Mr. Reagan, do you take any solace in the fact that the U.S. space program, as we know it, has been safer than the Soviets, that the Soviets have lost many more people? And President Reagan looked down the table at me and he said, quote, it's something to cling to right now, but it doesn't lessen the grief, unquote.
No, not at all. This is a risky business yet. We're on the edges of human exploration and human achievement. We're taking the kind of risks required to do exciting, adventurous, and valuable things, and everybody that was involved in this, from Krista McAuliffe to Commander SCOBEE, knew quite well that it was a risk, and were willing to undertake that risk.
Also today, Mr. Reagan underscored that a reporter asked him how he felt about the fact that the teacher was on board, and the President sort of said, in fact, he said, it's the last frontier. Those were his words.
Indeed. I think the identification of the public with the fact that one of them, an ordinary citizen, happened to be aboard this mission, not the 24 that went before it, I think broadens the tragedy, and therefore is bad luck is understating it by several orders of magnitude. There were 6 others who had dedicated their careers to the shuttle program on this, and their loss for the program is equally as great. For the country, I guess the identification is with Krista, though.
Have you any fear whatsoever that NASA's outstanding record with safety and achievement will be lost in the wake of a backlash because of this tragedy?
I hope not. That would be totally irrational behavior. This country is capable of behaving irrationally in crisis situations, and I think Mr. Reagan has said that what is needed now is to find out what happened, fix it, and go ahead with the program, and that's exactly the right response, that there are too many things worth doing that the people that were on this mission had dedicated themselves to stop, to say it's not worth doing, that because of this accident the program will not go ahead, would be, among other things, a tragedy for those that were involved in this accident.
What about our national sense of presumption? We Americans over the past decade or so became so attuned to the space program operating functionally very well, being well funded, safety being way up there. It's almost as if we've taken this very dangerous program for granted. We never had tragedies per se, except the ones that we've been reporting on prior to this one today. And it's as if we didn't watch these launches after a couple of years because they were so routine. I suppose maybe we should have been reminded with each launch that this is very dangerous, and we're very fortunate.
Well, but it is supposed to be routine. That's the idea of the program now, is that each launch is not an adventure. Of course it is for the individuals involved. So is driving to work in the morning or getting on a 747. The necessity is making sure the resources, the people, the funding to assure constant safety is available. To shortcut the program would enhance the chance of something like this happening.
Certainly there will be a full-scale, full-court press kind of investigation, but based on the videotapes you've seen, based on what you know about this vehicle, what's your hunch as to what happened?
Well, first of all, I haven't seen the videotapes, and I'm not sure I want to, since I wasn't exposed to them in the first place. I think it's almost irresponsible to begin to say, well, it was external tank rupturing, or because it was cold, or some of the other things that I've heard already. The people who are close in, who have the data, are the people that ought to say what happened. There's, of course, a pressing curiosity, but there's not much we can do about it, and I think it's, as I say, almost irresponsible for those not close to the technical character of what went on to be running around talking about what happened.
Your reservation is appreciated. John Logston with the Science Policy Program at George Washington University here in the nation's capital.
Thank you.
Now, let's go to our man in Atlanta, Tom Mintier. Tom?
Thank you, Bernie. For those who may be just joining us, let's turn the clock back a few hours now and take you to a replay from the Kennedy Space Center just a few moments before Challenger lifted off at 11:39 after several hours of delay because of ice problems on the structure surrounding the shuttle. They sent a crew of 8 men out to knock that ice off.
We have main engines start.
Main engines have started here. It appeared everything was normal.
1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
The roll maneuver taking place. Everything still looked normal about 20 seconds into flight. This is the VIP viewing area, taking pictures as they normally do every time there is a shuttle flight.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 90.
Everything appeared normal here.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
In a second, they were ordered to throttle up. And then the last words from the shuttle.
Throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Huge ball of fire and the solid rockets veering out of control. One went left and then curved. Here's the slow motion replay. You see a fire between the shuttle and the external tank. And then an explosion right at the point where the shuttle and the tank are connected, and a huge fireball. Recovery efforts. Here are the spectators watching as the shuttle cleared the pad.
We have no downrange.
There is Krista McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan. They were told by a NASA official, walked up to them and said the vehicle had exploded. Mrs. Corrigan, stunned, looked back at him and repeated his words as a question. The vehicle has exploded. And then they were led away. Let's go now to Bernie Shaw in Washington. Bernie?
Thank you, Tom. The chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Pete Domenici, of New Mexico is in the Senate Radio TV gallery. Let's listen in.
Very human, wonderful people. The experts, the astronauts, are very marvelous aviators and technical people. They did their share. Something just happened, and we don't know what it is yet.
Senator,
Okay.
did you see the explosion, and what was your first reaction?
Yeah, it was purely accidental. I came back from the White House, was sitting behind my desk, doing some other work, and a staffer walked in and said, it blew up. And I said, what blew up? And they said, the space shuttle. I said, on the ground? No, in space. We turned on the TV, and there they were replaying it. So I was not watching it live, but it was just the same as if it was live, because I'd heard very little before, maybe 40 seconds. As it did that, I really couldn't believe that it was happening. I kept looking for something to come out the other end, and it didn't. So it was a rather amazing sight for me, and in fact, I thought maybe it was something else for a while. Okay? Thank you all very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Members of the 99th Congress still reacting to this tragedy. You've often heard the word redundancy in our space systems. Lots of safety precautions taken, lots of safety procedures involved, escape procedures. Tom Mintier tells us about it.
Bernie, there used to be ejection seats that had parachutes on the space shuttle. Recently, as the program advanced and they had more and more shuttles online, they removed those seats to allow more room for scientific experiments and other things to be in the space shuttle. The investigation, of course, is going to go on for a long, long time, barely just getting started now. All really that NASA has right now to work with is some of the data that was
Wheel drive 4000 CS Quattro from the swift completion of its appointed rounds. Audi, the art of engineering.
Saturday, romance becomes deadly. Chill hell.
This is News Watch 6.
Good evening. NASA says tonight it now knows where the Shuttle Challenger's crew compartment is and that remains of the astronauts are aboard. The announcement came this afternoon from NASA, which said family members have been notified. Newswatch 6 Brevard Bureau Chief Jacqueline Bolden reports.
Ever since Challenger exploded into a ball of fire just 73 seconds after liftoff on the morning of January 28th, there have been rumors and speculation that the sturdy crew compartment might have survived the blast, even if the 7 astronauts did not. NASA now confirms that the USS Preserver located the crew compartment with sonar on Friday. It is located in about 100 feet of water, 25 miles northeast of Cape Canaveral. Divers went down Saturday for a closer look, confirmed that it was the cabin, and reported finding remains of the astronauts. In a written statement, NASA said family members were notified Friday of the finding. NASA has not said if the entire crew was inside the module or what condition the cabin was in. Challenger's crew compartment consisted of 2 levels. The lower is the middeck, where Krista McAuliffe, Greg Jarvis, and Ellison Onizuka were strapped in. On the flight deck above were Dick SCOBEE, Mike Smith, Judy Resnick, and Ron McNair. The USS Preserver returned to Port Canaveral under the cloak of darkness Saturday night and was met by NASA officials, but the crew compartment, NASA says, is still on the ocean floor. NASA says space agency officials will make no further comment on the discovery of the crew compartment until recovery operations are complete and identification of the bodies has been made. Recovery is expected to take several days. The bodies will probably be brought here to the medical facility at Patrick Air Force Base for autopsies. I'm Jacqueline Bolden on the News Watch.
As we told you, NASA says it informed family members before releasing information to the news media. But at least 2 families say tonight they learned the news from the news media. The families of Ronald McNair and Gregory Jarvis say NASA did not inform them. The Jarvis family lives in Orlando, and tonight Newswatch 6 reporter Pat Claiborne spoke to them.
Gregory Jarvis's father and stepmother say they learned of NASA's discovery from a news reporter. The Jarvises say NASA officials still have not told them their son's remains and the remains of the other 6 astronauts have been found.
I'm angry, you know, that I haven't been notified. All through this investigation and so forth, I haven't really been contacted.
Although the Jarvises are upset NASA officials did not contact them, they say they are relieved their son's remains may have been located.
I never did like the thought of being blown to pieces. I'd like to, you know, I'd like to have had something, but some tangible proof, you know, that they were somewhere anyway. They just weren't, they just didn't disappear.
Maybe it will be a filing that we haven't really been able to have up to this point.
The Jarvises were at the Kennedy Space Center January 28th when Challenger lifted off and exploded. Although NASA called the accident non-survivable, the Jarvises said they needed proof.
I have had this.
We'll hear from the parents of one of the astronauts who live here in Orlando.
TWA flight attendants say the airline will suffer since they walked off the job. We'll tell you why.
And we'll tell you what's coming up in the entertainment business in Orlando this week.
Stay with us. The Eyewitness News update is next.
Brute force.
You're watching WFTV Channel 9.
From Central Florida's leading news station, this is the Eyewitness News Update.
Good evening. NASA salvage crews now have the grim task of bringing up the crew cabin of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It's been found on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean.
Ken, NASA announced late today that it found the cabin 2 days ago. It also says there are remains of the astronauts still on board. Recovery of the compartment may take a couple of days. Once it's complete, the remains will be identified at Patrick Air Force Base. Here's more from Ron DePaulis.
A NASA spokesman said the crew compartment wreckage was found Friday by sonar soundings from a search ship about 25 miles northeast of Cape Canaveral. Saturday, divers from the recovery ship USS Preserver made a positive identification of the debris located in about 100 feet of water and determined there were remains of crew members inside what's left of the cabin. The NASA spokesman stressed it isn't known if the remains include all 7 astronauts killed when the Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after liftoff, January 28. Family members of Challenger's crew were notified by NASA, except for the father of astronaut Ronald McNair, who said he learned of the discovery from television reports. NASA will make no further comment until the recovery is complete. Depending on sea conditions, recovery of the cabin wreckage could take several days. Ron DePaulis, ABC News.
As you just heard, NASA says it has notified all the families that the bodies have been found, but the family of astronaut Greg Jarvis says they haven't heard a word from NASA. They heard the news from one of their neighbors after it was on television this afternoon. And tonight, they told me by telephone from their Central Florida home that they still haven't heard from NASA. Needless to say, they're upset.
Yes, I'm upset about it because when somebody tells you on the television that all the families have been notified, suddenly you find out that you were notified, you feel like you've been left out.
Well, we tried to get in touch with them through other sources, and you can't get in touch with them. No. Well, if there was something that you would say to NASA tonight, what would it be? Why didn't you call us?
Mr. and Mrs. Jarvis say they joined the family that was never contacted as well, the family of astronaut Ron McNair. Ken?
In other news, striking TWA flight attendant
married to June Kent of San Antonio, Texas. Commander SCOBEE enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. Pilot Michael Smith, he's from Beaufort, North Carolina, and his NASA experience is being one of the astronauts selected, a candidate by NASA in 1980, and has been in the program for 6 years now. One of the other astronauts, Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka from Hawaii. 4th astronaut Ronald McNair from Lake City, South Carolina. There were 2 women on board, Judy Resnick from Akron, Ohio, and of course Krista McAuliffe, born in Boston, Massachusetts. The payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and he is born in Detroit, Michigan. We have no word on what indeed has happened to the crew, although, quite frankly, there is not much hope now that we've been told that the escape capsule, or what we saw come down by parachute anyway, is not the capsule containing the astronauts.
John, we've been told now that President Reagan
the
at
magnitude of that explosion was, as you saw, very severe. It appeared that the shuttle was just blown apart by whatever triggered that explosion.
Thank you, John. We have been told now by Sam Donaldson at the White House that President Reagan has been alerted and has been watching tape replays of the shuttle accident. For those of you who may have just tuned in, there has been a serious accident involving the Space Shuttle Challenger on this 25th Space Shuttle mission. Less than 2 minutes after launch, a massive explosion off the coast of Florida, and it appears that there are no survivors. There is no final confirmation from NASA. In fact, we're getting no information now from NASA. There has been a complete blackout of information and communications. There was one parachute that came down. It was not an escape capsule for the 7-member crew. And this was a mission that had been postponed 3 previous times. Finally, after further delays this morning, what appeared to be a picture-perfect launch, and yet some 90 seconds later, that massive explosion in the sky. NASA control had been calmly clicking off the various elements of the launch that now here we're going to Larry Speaks at the White House, who apparently has an announcement coming up.
At what he has just seen replayed on television concerning the shuttle launch. We do not have any more information than is being provided to the public at this time. The way the Federal President found out about it is he was in the Oval Office with a group of senior staff preparing for some questions with a group of network correspondents and anchors that were having lunch in the White House today regarding the budget and the State of the Union. The Vice President and the Foreign Policy Advisor, John Poindexter, came in with others and informed the President that the news had just broken. We immediately adjourned our Oval Office meeting and went into an adjoining room, the President's study, where there's a television, and the President then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch. So once again, the President is concerned, he is saddened, he is very anxious to have more information on it. At the moment, as I say, we're learning most of our information from what the public is getting.
What is your best information as to the condition of the crew, Larry, at this point?
We don't have any more information than what is being provided to the public on television. Hopefully later we will be able to get some, and that's the President's first priority is to find out what information that is available. We just don't have any more. No, we have not from the Oval Office.
Will this affect in any way the plans for the State of the Union tonight?
I don't believe so. I'm certain that the President will feel compelled to mention this, depending on the outcome of what we learn here in a few minutes.
Will it affect the shuttle program, Larry?
Well, that's hard to say, you know, here in 15 or 20 minutes after an incident of this type is concerned. I'm sure it will not affect the United States' determination to consider to continue the exploration of space and all the benefits we've received from it. While this is indeed tragic, it certainly will not deter the United States in its interest in space exploration.
All the problems that the shuttle has had, will any substantial reevaluation be done of the program itself?
Well, once again, you're very premature in asking a question concerning the future of the space program. The United States has met adversity many times before in the space program. It is one of the most effective and successful programs of that type that any country has ever undertaken.
Larry, can you tell us anything specifically that the President said, any quotations, and did he make any mention of the fact that the teacher that he suggested, that the program of a teacher in space, that teacher was on board this flight?
Well, I know that was on his mind. Quite frankly, the President stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. you could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him. As I say, he was virtually watched in silence.
Might anyone from the White House be leading some sort of investigating team, or will it just be up to NASA to investigate this?
All this is very, very early, and there's just nothing we can say. Our immediate concern is the crew, and all of these other questions will just have to be deferred until much later.
Was anything said about the fact that the teacher was on board this plane?
Well, it was something that was on all of our minds, that we did have the first teacher in space, really the first civilian, so to speak, other than our members of Congress who have flown in space, and certainly that's on our mind.
Are there any scientific aides who have been able to say that they could survive such an explosion?
Just don't have that kind of information
You
yet.
said that the Vice President at Poindexter informed the President. How did the White House learn about it?
I'm certain that we probably learned it from the news media, as we do many times when incidents like this occur unexpectedly.
Might this influence the decision about whether other civilians will be allowed on the shuttle from now on, Larry?
Once again, all of these questions, our immediate concern is for the fate of the crew, to find out exactly what has happened to those 7 people aboard. All of these other questions we'll just have to wait till later. Dale?
Tell us anything about what the President's schedule, how the President's schedule is changing now?
The President's schedule has not changed. He will keep on with what he had planned today and the State of the Union tonight. And once again, I think the only change in his schedule would be to simply be updated and try to seek the facts in this.
Will the President be making any phone calls to the family, Larry?
I just don't know. Customarily he does, but we're going to wait till we find out what the facts are.
Larry, you watched in silence, but were there no quotes that you could give?
Nothing. It was virtually in silence.
You know what's being done now, Larry, in terms of searching for?
No. All of that information we just do not have yet. Dale, you had one question and you want to go on? Okay.
What are your plans? What are your plans about briefing the rest of the afternoon on this?
Well, I think once we find out what the facts are, and particularly what the fate of the crew is, then we'll be prepared to say something.
Larry, did you detect any sign of emotion as the President watched? Was he shaking his head? Was his eyes moist?
Concern, anxiety, silence.
You've been listening to a briefing by White House spokesman Larry Speaks. The President expressing his obvious concern. He's been watching the tapes, but he does not know any more than we do about the fate of the 7-member crew of the Challenger after that tremendous explosion less than 2 minutes after launch from Cape Canaveral this morning. With me now, Peter Jennings, who has been at the White House this morning and is here in Washington with me. Peter, you've been following this shuttle program like the rest of us. Just a tremendous shock so shortly after liftoff.
In fact, Steve, I must tell you, you heard Larry speak, sir. I was actually sitting in the White House with a group of other correspondents waiting for the President to come in and talk to us about the State of the Union message, and Don Regan, the Chief of Staff, was handed a note and said to us simply, the space shuttle has exploded, details to follow, at which point I fled the room, and I sympathize with Mr. Speaks at this point because he indeed is getting virtually all of his information at this point from us. That critical moment for people who have just joined us occurred, as you've been telling us, thank you, with 90 seconds roughly after liftoff. And very interesting, as I rushed from the White House, almost the very first explanation, or perhaps explanation, was that it occurred as they went from power up. And here we see it again. You can see on the outside there, of course, those are the solid rocket boosters. And listening to John Lyons, ABC's longtime space observer, coming back on the radio in the taxi, John was saying, of course, if it is those solid rocket boosters which go, they would drive the Challenger itself totally out of control.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
There it is. There's the phrase, throttle up, which means they're going to increase from about 65.
There was the explosion.
There it is.
The interesting thing is, we're being told by NASA Control that it was a completely normal liftoff from their perspective, and prior to the explosion, there was no indication of any trouble, as you could detect from the voice of Mission Control.
That's right. In fact, it must have been extraordinarily stunning in Mission Control for the Mission Control communicator to catch up mentally with what he was seeing on his screen, very much as we are seeing. The first air
disaster, or the first in-air disaster, in the 56 U.S. man-in-space missions. You'll recall, Steve, there was a disaster on the ground back in 1967 during the Apollo program, but this is the first in all of the manned space program.
Peter, we have tape now of NASA's first explanation of exactly what happened. NASA has been quite silent, but here is their information.
Repeating the information that we have at this time. We had an apparently nominal liftoff this morning at 11:38 Eastern Time. The ascent phase appeared normal through approximately the completion of the roll program and throttle down and engine throttle back to 104%. At that point, we had an apparent explosion. Subsequent to that, the tracking crews reported to the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle appeared to have exploded and that we had an impact in the water downrange at a location approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. At the time that data was lost with the vehicle, according to a poll by the flight director Jay Green of the positions here in Mission Control, there were no anomalous indications, no indications of problems with the engines or with the SRBs or with any of the other systems at that moment through the point at which we lost data. Again, this is preliminary information. It's all that we have at the moment, and we will keep you advised as other information becomes available. We had, there are recovery forces in the general area, others being deployed, including aircraft and ships. We saw what we believe to be paramedics parachuting into the impact area, and we have no additional word at this point. We will keep you advised as details become available to us. This is Mission Control, Houston.
There you have it, Peter.
I was just going to say, Steve, one of the very first things we would like to have people behind-the-scenes check is whether or not Challenger had an escape mechanism. Columbia did have one, but I'm under the impression that Challenger does not have the same configuration.
The parachute that we originally saw and reported as possibly an escape capsule is probably not a part of this new one. And as NASA Mission Control just advised us, the parachutes could have been paramedics dropping into the area of the impact of apparent wreckage in the Atlantic. What we have here is a situation where NASA nor anyone else is going to say what the final resolution is for the 7 crew members, but there is absolutely no hopeful sign from anything we've seen so far, that massive explosion. We have tape now of the 7...
Just before you go, hey, let me just interrupt, because somebody did say to me, Meyer, that in fact Challenger does not have the escape capsule. Columbia did in one of its early stages. We've had 24 of these missions. Columbia had it, Challenger did not. So what we were not seeing an escape capsule falling some 20, 30 miles out into the Atlantic.
Which, of course, does nothing to increase any signs of hopefulness. We were saying we have tape of the members of the crew early this morning as they had breakfast together before the mission. This 7-member crew, of course, the most prominent member, Christy McAuliffe, a school teacher from New Hampshire, the first private citizen astronaut from among 11,000 teacher applicants. There she is on your right this morning. Her husband and 2 children were watching the liftoff on television. Other members of the crew, Commander Francis Dick Scobee, co-pilot Michael Smith, crewmates Judith Resnick, Ellison Onazuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, along with Christy McAuliffe.
Dick Scobee, of course, the spacecraft commander who has been an NASA astronaut since back in 1978, an experienced commander, and a tremendous setback this morning as you see the crew in a much happier circumstance not long before they went off on what is surely, without question, the most ill-fated mission of the 24 space shuttle missions that have been flown in the last 5 years. Krista McAuliffe, as Steve has said, was clearly the most visible person on the flight, the first teacher in space, the first civilian other than a congressman. And ABC's Lynn Scher has been with her through much of the training program and now has a report on it.
That was a thrill.
When she left her classroom behind for a semester of space training, 37-year-old Krista McAuliffe temporarily traded 12 years of teaching for a new kind of learning. Listen to her description of the airplane ride that simulates zero gravity.
As you peak that parabola at the top, you have about 20 or 30 seconds of weightlessness, and all of a sudden, just like Peter Pan, you start flying up, and it was just unbelievable.
That's the enthusiasm that's made her a favorite of students at Concord High School in New Hampshire. This is where the Boston-born social studies teacher lives with her husband and 2 children, and where she put together her winning lesson plan.
It's clear from her NASA application that Krista McAuliffe took special care to relate her classes here at Concord High School to what she calls the real world. Her philosophy of teaching, she wrote, stresses community activities. The economics class finds out how local construction projects impact the city. Law classes visit the local courts.
She can take very complex concepts and simplify them, but not water them down, and she makes all her students understand things, but in an interesting manner.
She was explaining like the assembly line process, and she went into this story about when she used to package Twinkies on the assembly line. And I mean, I just laughed so hard, but I'm not gonna forget it.
That's also what helped her application stand out among the 11,000 NASA received, and what changed her life.
The teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe.
Suddenly, she was a celebrity. McAuliffe and her family were paraded along Main Street and featured on the front page. When she reported to NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, she was poked and prodded and outfitted and observed.
She's a sort of a risk taker. She does the unusual, the way she runs a class, and she's not afraid of things. She lives life. She's not afraid of it.
Teachers are always prepared.
And while she taught history and economics, her students figured out there was something else on her mind, too.
Even on the quizzes, she'd throw in an extra credit quiz about what are the 5 names of the space shuttle. So we always knew her interest in space was high.
McAuliffe's crewmates have graded her well, acknowledging theirs will always be known as the teacher mission. And she hopes the lesson about space travel on the shuttle will not just be for youngsters.
People actually, adults have asked me, how many stops is that shuttle going to make? You know, bring me back a moon rock.
It's the kind of misinformation Krista McAuliffe wants to correct. And it's why the high school teacher from New England won't be watching the next space shuttle launch. She'll be on it. Lynn Scher, ABC News, Concord, New Hampshire.
37-year-old Krista McAuliffe from New Hampshire, something of a risk taker, as someone described her, and among the millions and millions of people today who will be excruciatingly saddened by this tragedy are a number of her own school children who went down to the Cape yesterday, Steve, and were expressing, I remember on World News last night, how disappointed they were that the mission had not got off last night.
And of course there were also the many students from her high school in New Hampshire who were all in an assembly room watching the launch on television and were quickly returned to their own rooms by the teachers and the staff at the school after the apparent tragedy took place.
Just to remind you of exactly when it did take place, and also to admit to you that we're very much, as much in the dark as you are. We haven't heard much more from Mission Control than the bare basics. And it is, I think, probably, Steve, to some extent, a reflection of how successful the space program has been, and the shuttle program particularly, that those of us, like you and me, who followed the space programs with absolute passion 10 and 15 years ago, have begun to take it rather like the country did, rather casually, not knowing all of the details of every mission as intimately as we would have 10 or 15 years ago.
And we should recap for those of us, for those of you who may have just have joined us, that on this 25th launch of the Space Shuttle program, there has been a tremendous explosion, what appears to be a major tragedy and setback for the space program. Some 90 seconds after launch, when all appeared to be going well, as you will see in just a few moments, suddenly this massive explosion
Challenger, go at throttle up.
and almost complete silence from Cape Canaveral.
15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
You can tell there so instantly that the mission control communicator, the rest of us, was hardly even looking at his screen or couldn't believe what's happened. And there you see, flying out of control, what we don't know. Perhaps the solid rocket boosters, which are on the outside of the shuttle, or whether the external tank itself, which is attached to the shuttle, actually blew up. But at that point, they were going just under 2,000 miles an hour, 3 times the speed of sound. And if it, whatever it was, the solid rocket boosters or the external tank, it would have clearly driven the shuttle itself out of control. Let's listen to mission control.
Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
At this point, Challenger was 10.5 miles up and 8 miles out over the ocean. Debris has been scattered over a fairly wide area, some of it within 8 or 10 miles of Cape Canaveral itself. We cannot tell you, much to our regret, we cannot tell you what that is plunging towards the Atlantic Ocean. 7 crew members on board. Krista McAuliffe, the high school teacher. That parachute, by the way, perhaps a misleading picture for you. We've said a few while ago that Challenger did not have an escape capsule on board. There is some belief seeping up from Houston and from the Cape that that may be someone of a rescue function parachuting into the Atlantic. But again, we cannot tell you with any certainty anything more than we have.
Peter, this was the 4th attempt for the launch of this particular shuttle flight. 3 previous ones had been forced to postpone because of either weather problems or technical problems. And even today, there had been a delay. One because of a faulty fuel gauge, and another because of icicles on the launch pad. A temperature of 24 degrees this morning at Cape Canaveral.
John Quinones, who has been covering space for us down at Cape Canaveral, is now standing by at the Cape. And John, you clearly saw this with your own eye and not on a television monitor, am I correct?
That's right, Peter. I was outside with hundreds of spectators about 10 minutes before the scheduled liftoff. The launching had been delayed 3 days due to bad weather. As we reported last night, it was rescheduled to finally leave at 9:38 this morning. But we had a hard freeze here in Cape Canaveral overnight, and when we arrived at the launch pad, we saw a launch pad deck covered with ice. Overnight, water and fuel systems had been kept draining, bleeding over that area so that the fluids on the spaceship or launch pad would not freeze. At about 8 this morning, NASA told us that there was another problem with a fire detector, this time on board the Challenger. Some electronic components of that fire detector were replaced, and then we were told that at that time, all systems were go. The liftoff delayed by just 1 hour this morning and then rescheduled till 9:38. Finally, there were more delays. Apparently, the weather was a concern. Delayed till 11:38. Just minutes before the scheduled liftoff, I was out there in the spectator stands with hundreds of people, among them 18 school children from Krista McAuliffe's hometown, 3rd grade students who attended school with Krista's son, Scott Corrigan. Those children watched, gasping at the liftoff, very impressed, obviously. It appeared that very few of the spectators knew what had happened until about a minute into the liftoff when NASA control announced that something had gone wrong. The Shuttle Challenger simply blew apart as we saw it from the ground. I am told with a force of 2.5 million pounds of thrust. Awesome power that even NASA admits may leave very little to recover.
Let me ask you this. There must be turmoil there, John, at the Cape, as I'm sure there is in Houston as well. Do you have any indication from anyone there of an official or expert nature what may have happened?
No idea.
Well, that's simple, and that is clear, John.
We understand, Peter, that the recovery crews, we saw 2 parachutes that NASA cameras picked up and showed us floating to the ground. We are being told that it is believed that those are paramedics headed into the recovery area to see what they can find.
Okay, John, thank you very much. John Quinones at the Cape. Of course, once the Challenger was taken off mission control, that is to say the control of the mission shifts to Houston in Texas, And so at Cape Canaveral, why, as we suggest, there may be turmoil this morning, there is not an absolute amount they're going to be able, I think, Steve, to provide us in terms of information.
We've been told, Peter, that President Reagan was watching in stunned silence the replay after he was informed of what had happened. And one of the first recognitions of this morning's apparent tragedy came from the House of Representatives, which declared a moment of silence. The Reverend James David Ford, the chaplain, leading the House in the silence. Let's listen.
And at this special moment, let us remember in silent prayer those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago off Florida. Let us pray.
Reverend James David Ford leading the House of Representatives in a moment of silence.
May your spirit, O Lord, be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and every day, we pray. Amen.
This recognition for the 7 crew members of the Shuttle Challenger. The Challenger exploding less than 2 minutes off the launch pad this morning. No official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members, but there is very little to hope for at this point.
I've just been thinking, Steve, as to why people at Mission Control, even people watching this on television, might not have been alarmed in the first instance, because about 2.5 minutes into flight, normally, when those big external tanks break off, we are accustomed now to seeing this great ball of fire as those 2 tanks drop off and fall into the Atlantic.
Sitting here watching protectively, because we take these for granted now, that was the first thought of all of us. Hopefully, this is just an aberration on the normal separation that takes place. Obviously, it was much more than that. Let's look now at tape of the crew members as they arrived at Cape Canaveral last week.
Thank you very much.
Astronauts Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ron McNair, Greg Jarvis, and of course, Kristen Collin.
And
from New Hampshire.
They represent a great deal of the country, too, as you look at their names and see them before the mission. Dick SCOBEE is from Washington State. Mike Smith was born in Beaufort, North Carolina. Judy Resnick was born in Akron, Ohio. Ronald McNair from Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onizuka was born on the island of Kona in Hawaii. And Greg Jarvis, who is the payload specialist on board the mission, was born, if I'm not mistaken, in Boston, but I'm not absolutely sure about that one either. The same thing, by the way, Steve, has happened in the House of Representatives, happened in the Senate. Senator Jake Garn from Utah, of course, had been the first politician who had flown in space, rushed over to the Senate floor where he wanted to make a statement. There's no question. I mean, again, I have to come back to this business at the White House. We were all sitting around waiting for the president, as is often traditional on the day of the president's going to make a State of the Union message. And his chief of staff is there, his aides, and the president is in the next room preparing to come in. And there is this stunned silence where the safety of individual Americans on something which, A, we've become so accustomed to, but B, has just become so symbolic of America, this search into space, when it all happened. I don't doubt this is happening all over the country.
And it is just a simple fact that we identify with these people as special people, even though we had come to take for granted the remarkable feats that they accomplish on a regular basis. This, the 25th launch of a space shuttle.
Say that NASA had planned on everything except what happened this morning. As you know, they had abort modes, 4 of them, which would handle almost every situation, including, an escape chute down which they could ride off the launch pad. But this, whatever it was, this catastrophic failure was not in the NASA plan. And what it means to most of the experienced reporters here, who have been covering this beat and who are here in Pasadena because we've been observing Voyager passing by Uranus. What it means to most of the reporters here is NASA now has to go back to its drawing board. First, it has to find out what happened, and after that, in addition to finding out what happened, what do they do to fix it?
More disasters that never before in flight has a U.S. Manned flight had a disaster of this sort. There was the time on the pad when 3 astronauts were killed in the 1960s, but never in flight before. What is considered to be the most dangerous time liftoff to touchdown back in the shuttle program. We were in the first minute and 12 seconds this morning. That's clearly a dangerous time. When is considered the most dangerous time?
Well, we were right in the period that is considered the most dangerous time, because in that period from liftoff to the separation of the solid rocket boosters, 2 minutes and 7 seconds into liftoff, that is the time that is generally considered to be the most dangerous. There are two periods they really are concerned about. That is the first 15 seconds off the pad while it clears the pad area, and they determine that there are no immediate problems from something connected with the pad. And then starting at about a minute in, and this time we had the explosion at a minute 12, from about a minute to 2:07, this is the period when the determination is made if they're going into a proper course, a proper orbit, and that everything is working okay. And it is during that time that the thrust change explosion occurred, and after that they throttled down to a 60% level to reduce the force. So during the period of the explosion was during the period of maximum thrust with the space shuttle, and one of the two most dangerous periods during the entire mission.
It's just going to make, I think, people that much more conscious of safety as they were after the Apollo blow-up in '67.
When you look at husband Steve there in that tape recording, then you stop to realize that he and the two children, McAuliffe children, were watching live the launch this morning. And of course, less than 2 minutes after the launch, the massive explosion in space.
It is now just a little after 12:30 in the eastern United States, and not by any means to repeat it for the sake of repeating it, but because that's a program change in many of the places around the country. We're going to run again the liftoff of the Challenger as it took off from Cape Canaveral this morning. John Quinones described it to us from the Cape just a few moments ago as perfectly normal in every respect. You'll recall it had been delayed yesterday because of high weather, and it had been delayed the day before because they couldn't get a screw fully tightened down on one of the hatches. But for those of you around the country who may just be joining us now for the first time and may not have heard the news, perhaps not have seen it, here again is the liftoff of the shuttle from the Cape this morning. That is not the liftoff, that is the subsequent tragic result as something blows up about 7 to 10 miles above the Atlantic Ocean across the Cape. I must tell you, Steve, having now seen that 4 or 5 times, that great ball of fire looks to me like it may be one of the solid rocket boosters.
But enormous power, 2.5 million pounds of thrust. That is all a part of that launch that we have come to take so for granted. And that, of course, was the mix that we just saw exploding once again in that replay of what took place at shortly after 11:39 launch time, Eastern time this morning. The Space Shuttle Challenger with its crew of 7. We do not have any official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members. 2 women actually aboard, Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from New Hampshire, but also Judy Resnick, who was one of the mission specialists who had already logged 144 hours in space.
Okay. I'm told we can now look at the entire launch sequence, that is to say when the astronauts and the mission specialists went back on board early this morning, and there they are, liftoff from the Cape.
Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger.
Nonchalant.
Roll program confirmed.
Control.
Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel cells. 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Accelerating towards 2,000 miles an hour.
This 1,977 miles per hour, 10.4 miles up, 8 miles out at the time of the explosion.
And you are seeing that in slow motion, by the way, now.
Distance 7 nautical miles.
This the first in-flight disaster for the U.S. space program in 56 manned missions, going back to the original Shepard flight.
Steve, would you tell someone in our control room they have a key open and we're hearing everything that's going on in the building?
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Once again, for those of you who have just joined us, there has been a disaster on the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger with its 7-man crew. The shuttle exploding 1 minute, 15 seconds after launch from Cape Canaveral this morning. There had been a delay, one caused by a faulty gauge. There had also been a delay that was caused by ice forming on the pad because the temperature was 24 degrees this morning at Cape Canaveral. No indication that that had anything to do with the enormous explosion that took place as the shuttle was just reaching that maximum period of thrust in what had appeared to be an extremely normal launch. There was the normal excitement in the voice of mission control, and then the almost detached voice reading off the various numbers on what appeared to be a picture-perfect launch, but then was interrupted by this devastating explosion.
Steve, it is only now, 33 minutes after noon in the east, that all of the rescue teams are being allowed into what we will call the search area for the moment, because there was so much debris raining down from 10 miles up above that NASA feared for the safety of those people going to look for survivors, principally, is what they've got to look for. So only now, about 35 minutes after noon in the east, are people getting into the area to begin to search those waters of the Atlantic, which we have seen so desolate this morning.
And we might remind our viewers that while the earliest shuttles did have an escape capsule, the present ones have no particular escape mechanisms whatsoever. The capsule is its own entity.
It is that point in a mission where while the concern is immensely high at all times and you're beginning to push out towards orbit there, you're not as concerned. You'll recall in many of the space programs, the great concern has been for people on the launching pad. Yes. Back in 1967, when Gus Grissom, among others, was killed when the Apollo blew up on the launching pad, it became enormous concern for how do you get people out at that particular time. When the shuttle is driving for orbit and everything looks A-OK, you stop thinking about it
and
to some extent.
The explosion occurred this morning, we're told, at about the time that the Challenger was to enter its period of maximum aerodynamic pressure, 526,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, all aboard, and the massive explosion.
The first flight disaster in 56 missions, and as Steve has been saying so accurately, this is the 25th of the shuttle missions. And this highly accelerated program, you'll recall just the other day, they had to move, was it Columbia or Challenger? I get them mixed up sometimes, from California back quickly in order to get it ready, because the mission program is really going, and there is a lot of demand now for people in all realms of industry, politics, the military, to get up and use the capacities that the shuttle has provided for the U.S.
In fact, the shuttle program becoming a point of controversy because the question is it competitive with the European unmanned program that's also been putting payloads into space for private industry and for other users? The delays that the shuttle program has been experiencing the last few months, and weather in some cases, technical in other cases, has led to many calls for a reevaluation of the shuttle program. That, of course, is going to be an enormous question at the present time.
For the moment, of course, it is a human question with 7 crew members on board and unaccounted for as the result of a devastating explosion on board Challenger this morning. We are again able to call on the services, as we do so often, of the former Apollo astronaut Gene Cernan, who at the moment is on a telephone in Houston. Gene, I know you have heard the news. Try again. Gene, do you hear me to start with?
I sure do.
Gene, would you mind turning your television set down, or the radio that is in your immediate vicinity, and perhaps we can hear you rather than it?
Okay, it's all down. I'm all private here.
Okay, well then it is something at our end. Perhaps, Gene, if you'll stand by just for a second. I don't think we should impose that kind of sound on people. We very much want to hear what you have to say. Steve, I was talking about being at the White House this morning and saw the Vice President on the way in. He has also been very shaken by this. He was on his way to see the President. And the reaction in this city will have an enormous power because of the political impetus that the space program has been given by various administrations in the United States. The President and his particular attachment to sending a teacher into space to reflect American ideals. And we have now reaction in the White House then for the President, the Vice President. We have it in the Congress, at the House of Representatives, with moments of silent prayer. Senator Garn from Utah, really the first civilian or non-NASA person who was one of the overseers of NASA's program and NASA's budget. He went up. Everybody very much shaken in this capital, as best I can tell, certainly in my ear this morning, by this awful tragedy.
All of us shaken. Senator Garn, we're told now, is going to have a statement in about 20 minutes. He, of course, was the first member of Congress to go into space, a veteran pilot in his own right, and that's a perspective that you just don't share with anyone else.
Gene Cernan, I hope, is now standing by without a great deal of interference. Gene, can you hear me clearly now?
I sure can, Peter.
Talk to us for a bit. What do you think?
It's pretty tough to talk about a lot of things at this point in time. This is, I guess, the one catastrophic incident that we all knew was possible going way back to day one, I guess, in the space program, and it probably always will be possible as we look into the future when man is involved in space that we couldn't quite fully protect against, except to build a vehicle that was obviously not 100, but 99+% safe. This is a thing we tried to legislate out again since day one, and successfully we did it. It's not enough to say that you can justify exploration with human lives, although that's been the case historically. I guess that's where we find ourselves in today.
Gene, is there any particular point in the launch sequence that they might have been at that was known to be a critical point?
Well, of course, the first stages of just getting off the pad, those first several seconds, we all knew even in Apollo, the first 30 or 40 or 50 seconds of that flight, if something went wrong, the crew was just preparing for throttling back the engines up to their full force, which have got them into orbit. And then all of a sudden it was just like a bolt of lightning, I guess.
Gene, have you got access to a television set where you are?
I sure do.
We're going to roll the launch again from the very beginning. Can you see it?
Unfortunately, the local network station is on local network news, and I don't have that.
And liftoff.
Okie dokie. We're seeing liftoff. Gene, describe to us, because you know it so well anyway, what happens from liftoff or right off.
Well, the liquid engines, the engines that are fueled by liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, which is by nature explosive, but they're very good propellants. We used them way back in Apollo. Fire and for a few seconds, and the computers say everything is okay on a pad, and then the solid rocket boosters fire, and you can equate those to a firecracker. They're gunpowder, basically, if you want an analogy. They fire, and as soon as they fire, the shuttle is on its way. The solid rocket boosters fly for a period of time to help boost the entire spacecraft to an orbit where the liquid engine then can sustain its velocity or its travel into orbit.
Beginning to roll over now, Gene.
Okay, pardon?
It's beginning to roll over now, right?
Okay, it's beginning to roll over. I'm not able to see this at this point in time, but when it begins to roll over, there is a point at which the thickness of the air, or the density of the air, and the speed of the shuttle itself create the greatest pressure, and that's where the shuttle.
John, I understand that.
And that's where the shuttle will tend to.
John, we're going to call you in at some point.
And create pressure on it, so they throttle the engines down to go a little slower through
do you hear ground like
that area. They then power up to 105%, which is what they expect to do of the maximum rated thrust of the engine. And
Gene, let me interrupt you for a second. We see in our picture now the explosion has occurred, what looks like one of the solid rocket boosters shooting off to the left of the screen in space. Does that suggest to you that the explosion would have been on the external tank on board?
Peter, far be it from me to speculate, but as I've seen that sequence, and I think if you look closely, you'll see both solid rocket motors appear to continue to fire. You know, we've seen them many times after they shut down, break away, and fall back in the oceans on many other sequences. In this case, they did indeed break away. It looks like the force of the explosion
broke them away, and they continued to fire. There's no reason that they shouldn't fire. There's no way to shut them down anyway. And they fired, although somewhat aimlessly, as you see the smoke, they traveled through space. And then what was the bulk, the core of the shuttle spacecraft itself and the external tank has just disappeared. So it appears to me...
Gene, let me interrupt you again. We see something now traveling at a very high rate of speed down towards the ocean. You've seen that sequence? Have you any thought what that might be? The close-up shot, you've seen it?
Well, again, it might very well be, if it looks like there's any kind of thrust or fire coming out of it, I would assume it might very well be one of those solid rocket boosters without any direction, no computer telling it where to go, and of course gravity's taking over and it's just pointing down toward here.
Officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at...
But it appears, you know, again, it's so difficult to speculate in a case like this, Peter, but it appears to me that the explosion occurred within obviously the propellant area, or the shuttle and the external tank itself, and not in the solid rocket boosters. Solid rocket boosters are inherently safe. They either work and burn till extinction, or they don't work at all.
Gene, it is unfair of me to even ask you to speculate, so I will ask you for the moment if you wouldn't mind staying with us on the telephone. Oh, God, Steve, we've got people who are much better at these models than you and me. But
I have you now on television, Peter, so I'm watching what you're doing.
Well, Gene, I hope I don't make any mistakes in trying to explain to people the basics of what may have happened here. Here is the shuttle itself. Here is Challenger. It lifted off from the ground, as you know, in a position like this, and was beginning to angle its way into orbit, going not only upwards, but going downrange. And these two solid rocket boosters, these solid rocket fuels, are the ones that you always see burning so brightly. At some point, about 2 minutes...
Parents of schoolteacher McAuliffe as they watched the space shuttle launch this morning, a launch that began for them with great pride and joy and ended in tears. Before that awful moment, everything seemed fine as the astronauts ate breakfast before the launch.
Dan, this was the astronauts as they were having breakfast earlier this morning. It was a very happy group. They were very pleased to be going on this shuttle. Ellison Onizuka, and you saw Krista McAuliffe. And as they had breakfast, there was the traditional cake wishing them good luck. For identification purposes, you have Judy Resnick and Ron McNair there, and Greg Jarvis. They were all ready to go and anxious to go after several delays, and as they left the breakfast area and left the building where they had been spending the time, Krista McAuliffe said, "It's going to go today." Krista McAuliffe was looking forward to this flight. She was extremely anxious. She felt after several months of training now she'd become part of the team. She still considered herself a teacher rather than an astronaut, but she felt that she had become part of the team. NASA now has some cameras that have reached the scene of the incident, and I don't know if you're able to see this in New York, Dan, but I can tell here we see several pieces of debris that are out into the ocean, which appear from every indication we have here to be, maybe 3, 4, or 5 miles off the coast of Florida here at the Kennedy Space Center. It appears in looking at the screen, that there are small pieces of debris scattered over a wide area. This is a NASA plane that is flying over the impact area. According to the first reports from people on the scene, that it was just small pieces showered down for several seconds and almost, it seemed like several minutes. However, it is more likely that it was a few seconds. You can see in the center of your screen, as they zoom in, small pieces from the Space Shuttle Challenger. And these are the first scenes from the recovery operation. NASA has sent several paramedics into the area. The paramedics are now in the water, and they are looking for any evidence that they can find or the possibility of any survivors. These are the first pictures that we've been able to see from the recovery scene just a few miles off the Kennedy Space Center. It appears from looking at this that these are relatively small pieces. This is a very large, the shuttle is very large along with the solid rocket boosters. And what we are able to see in the ocean itself appear to be quite small pieces, relatively speaking. Somewhat similar to what you have seen as the results of a number of plane crashes when there has been an explosion and there's just very little left.
We do want to point out that these are live pictures from the recovery area, which is a short distance east of the United States mainland off Florida. Since the explosion aboard Space Shuttle Challenger happened this morning only a minute and 12 seconds into flight, and given the size, the huge fireball, one is not surprised to see so little debris in the water there. Bruce, it may be worth that we've had some questions. Clearly anything as complicated as one of these space shuttle launches about what could have happened there. Perhaps what we should do is again talk about at what stage the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning was in during the launch and the liftoff, and what appears to have happened. Now, what we will try to do is, do you have a model there, Bruce, or not?
Dan, I do not have a model here in front of me. I think I'll have one here in a couple of minutes.
Well, help me as we go.
Have been using has been very good in the way that you have been explaining it. And connected with that, the stop-action videotape that you have been looking at, you can actually see the point of where the explosion occurred. Now, there are several possibilities here, and you must realize that NASA has made no announcement at all. But for those people who have viewed a number of these flights, there are several things come to mind immediately. At the point in the flight when the explosion took place, there was 250,000 gallons a second of superfluids, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, flowing to the engines. And it was during that point, approximately a minute 12 into the flight, that it appeared from the stop-action videotape that a small explosion occurred, a very small one, and then a major explosion in the main tank. This is the tank where all of the fuel is stored. This is a tank that is not reusable. It normally drops off over the Indian Ocean. But this was completely full at the time. And when that main explosion, that is the fireball that you saw. It is that main tank exploding. It appeared to us here, those of us who were looking at the videotape that you were showing, there was a very small, just a second or maybe even a millisecond prior to the main explosion, a smaller ignition or a little explosion in the solid rocket booster, as you indicated earlier. But it is a time when they're at full thrust, 104% thrust they call it here. It is the time during the shuttle mission when there is the most power during the entire flight. And after they get into orbit and the solid rocket boosters fall away at just after 2 minutes into the flight, then they throttle back to 60% of thrust. But at the time the explosion occurred, it was the time when the thrust was at the strongest point of
clear blast. Tom, the NASA officials are saying that it's really virtually impossible for them to have prepared for a disaster of this kind while they have a 100-member recovery crew there at the launch site right along the landing strip. Should there trouble develop and should the space shuttle have to come back for an emergency landing, they're there to help out. But there's really nothing that they can do out over the open sea except have ships in position and try to get there and pick up the pieces and see what they can do well after the fact.
Yeah, John, what they have is, in effect, plans prepared in case there's something minor that goes wrong, and that airplane, the space shuttle, and that's really what it is, has to make a quick return and make a landing back once again at the Kennedy Space Center. But nothing to prepare for an explosion of this kind, a tragedy of this scope, because there's no way that you could get out of that. Even if you had parachutes, you're at 9 miles up. And, of course, it's very unlikely that anyone could survive a parachute jump of that magnitude. And they were not prepared to do that in any event. There are some emergency escape procedures from when it's on the ground, in case something goes wrong then. There is, as I say, there are some prepared emergency procedures for if something minor goes wrong and they can return, and then they have what they call a once-around procedure. If something goes wrong and they don't get into the orbit that they want to, they can land in Spain or they can land in California at different places, but nothing to deal with an explosion of this kind today, because there seemed to be nothing left of the spacecraft itself.
We're told that at the time of the explosion that Dr. William Graham, who is the administrator of NASA, was on Capitol Hill. He was getting ready to meet with a congressman and talk about NASA's budget. And just as they were ready to start that meeting, the administrator, Graham, said, let's turn on the TV and watch the liftoff of the Shuttle Challenger. They saw it, and immediately he knew something was wrong, and we are told he called officials at NASA and said, what has happened? And they told him, of course, there had been an explosion, and there was very little chance that there could be any survivors aboard the shuttle.
Okay, we expect to hear from Senator Jake Garn, who is on Capitol Hill today in about 10 minutes at the Senate Press Gallery. Senator Garn was the first civilian to go on board one of these flights. There was some criticism at the time that he was chosen for that flight because he's on a committee that is instrumental in determining the size of the NASA budget. He's a former Air Force fighter pilot, and yet he did have some difficulty on re-entry.
The tower.
Now control.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go and throttle up. Challenger, go and throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The explosion has occurred. Mission Control on Houston at this moment, this morning, just after the explosion, simply didn't know what had happened. Smoke trails, debris begins to fall.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Obviously a major malfunction.